And now may I request Mr. Harpreet Singh, Partner Real Estate and Infrastructure, PricewaterhouseCoopers, to kindly address the audience.
Honorable Minister Shri Ravinderjit Singh Ji, Mr. Talwar, Mr. Raheja, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and a very warm welcome to the India Realty Congress 2017. Now, RERA has become a reality and we are living in a very different world from a real estate industry standpoint. All new projects now need to be registered under RERA before a sale can be made. Existing projects where completion certificates have not been received would also need to be registered. So I know all of us are facing a lot of challenges as far as the implementation of this act is concerned. And there are a lot of questions which all of us have in our mind. So in that sense, I think today's conference is very timely. And I'm sure we will debate and discuss some of these issues today and come to some logical conclusions. Now, in order to begin with, let us just look at the objectives behind RERA. There are three key objectives why RERA has been put in place. The first and the foremost is it is an act to regulate and promote the sector. Now, real estate probably was the only sector which concerned the masses but wasn't regulated. So I think that anomaly now has been set right by the government. We will have a regulator at a state level, and that regulator will control the functioning of real estate sector in that state. It is an act which heavily focuses on transparency. There will be a web portal which will be set up in each state. That web portal will have details of all the projects which are being executed in that state. Updates would need to be provided by the developer. Things like, what is the construction status update, number of apartments booked, etc. All this information will be available to general public. So this will bring in a lot of transparency in the sector, and I think put a lot of pressure on the industry players to meet their commitments. Third, I think in the foremost provision or objective behind RERA is the protection of consumer interest. Now there is a very stringent framework which has been specified in RERA within which the developers have to operate now. And any deviation from this framework would sort of involve severe consequences, penalties, fines, etc. And the customer has a lot of rights available in terms of seeking a refund along with interest, or seeking a compensation and staying on the project. So these are the three objectives which I thought we should keep in mind as we go about debating about RERA today. RERA is a central act, and under RERA, state governments need to finalize the rules for implementation of the act. And there are three key things state governments need to do. One is issuing the final rules for implementation. The second is setting up a regulatory authority. Third is setting up a web portal. Now, states had almost 1 year to react to this or to incorporate all these things, but unfortunately, they are really lagging behind. So as we speak, out of 28 states, only 11 states have issued the finalized rules. So 17 states haven't issued the rules, although RERA is effective from 1st May 2017. And out of these 11 states, only 3 states have a web portal which is up and running: Kerala, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra. So these are the only states which have a web portal up and running. Union territories are doing slightly better. Out of 7, 6 have a finalized rules which have been notified, but none of them have a web portal which is up and running. Now, under these circumstances, I'm not sure how industry would comply with RERA. And I think if state governments do not act really fast on this, the real estate activity in this country will be very badly hit in the coming weeks and months. Let's look at some of the stakeholders which are covered by the act. The first and the foremost is the promoter. Now, there's a very wide definition of promoter given in the act. And in general sense, promoter would refer to the developer of the project. If there are multiple parties involved, like in case of a joint development agreement, all parties would qualify as promoter. Maharashtra RERA has come up with a concept of co-promoter. So in case there is a scenario where the landowner or the investor is entitled to a saleable area or a share in the project revenue, they would be termed as co-promoters. And co-promoters would also be bound by certain provisions of RERA around maintenance of bank account and stuff like that. So investors, I think, particularly need to be very careful that they need to look at this definition very carefully. And when they go out and invest in a project, they need to make sure that whether they want to become a promoter or not. Because there are a lot of obligations which have been cast on the promoter under the act, and there are severe consequences if those are not fulfilled. The second important stakeholder is LOT. And as I mentioned, LOTs have a lot of rights under the act. If the developer doesn't meet his or her commitment, the LOTs can walk out of the project, seek refund along with interest. they can stay in the project, seek compensation, and there's a concept of association of allottees which is being introduced, which will take over the maintenance of common areas once the project is up and running. The third stakeholders are real estate agents. So all real estate agents now will have to register under the Act to remain in business. They will have to register with the state regulatory authority. And there are a lot of do's and don'ts which have been specified for the real estate agents. The fourth aspect is setting up of a real estate regulatory authority at the state level. This is the authority which will administer the provisions of the Act, will be responsible for implementation of the Act in the state. There will be an appellate tribunal which will be set up. Any party who is aggrieved by the decision of the authority can appeal to the appellate tribunal and seek relief. And there will be a central advisory council. This council will work with the central government in terms of helping central government in the implementation of this Act and on matters of public policy. So these are the six key stakeholders as far as RERA is concerned. And while lender community is not directly covered under RERA, but I think they will also have to relook at their existing arrangements. The escrow mechanisms which they have currently undergoing, those may be overridden by RERA, so they will have to relook at those arrangements. Even in scenarios if they want to take over a project because of a default, it cannot be a unilateral act. They may need consent of the allottees before they can do that. So lender community really need to think hard about financing going forward and what structure they would want to follow. Now let's spend some time on some of the key provisions of RERA and how these need to be implemented. The first and the foremost is around the requirement of registration of projects. So henceforth, any new project where a sale needs to be done has to be first registered with the state regulatory authority. So the concept of pre-launch or pre-sale goes out of the window. Existing projects, where completion certificates have not been received would also need to be registered by 31st of July. Now, state governments have taken a varied approach here. Some state governments have kind of diluted the Act. To give you an example, in UP, if the development work in a project is fully done and an application for completion certificate has been made, such projects need not be registered. Similarly, Haryana draft rules had a similar provision, but I think there are a lot of objections which have been raised, and let's see what comes out in the final rules. But as of now, as per Act, all projects where completion certificates have not been received need to be registered by 31st of July. Now, at the time of registration, there's a lot of information which you have to give for registration purposes. This would include the financial statements of the promoter, track record of the promoter, number of projects executed, details about the project, sanction plans, layout plans, the agreements, allotment letters which you propose to enter. All that needs to be shared with the authority. And all this would be made available to the public. So I think while you go about registering your projects, you need to keep in mind that this information will be in public domain and you can be held liable if you don't meet your commitments. Another important aspect at the time of registration is the project duration. The registration which the authority would give would be linked to the duration of the project. So if you said 3 years, I will execute the project, the registration would be for a period of 3 years. Extensions would be possible by paying additional fee, but not beyond 1 year. So, you can't go beyond 1 year of your original duration as far as the project completion is concerned. And if you don't do that, the penal provisions kick in. The second important aspect is around the model sale agreements. Now, the Central Act provides the state governments will come up with model agreements, and these are the agreements that will be signed between the developer and the allottees. These agreements would need to be registered before the developer can accept more than 10% of the payment towards the cost of the projects. So the moment you reach the 10% threshold of the total apartment value, the ATS would have to be registered. This clearly has stamp duty implications, And secondly, I think the other question which is being raised is that what happens to the agreements for existing projects which have been signed a couple of years back and which are now going to be registered under RERA. So there are divergent views around it. One of the views which is emerging is that the existing agreements may need to be modified to make them compliant with RERA if the project gets covered under RERA. But it's again a debatable issue, so I'm sure it will get debated today and some views get formed around it. The third provision probably which is the most important from a consumer protection standpoint is the 70-30 rule. Now, Central Act provides that every promoter will have to open a separate bank account for each of the projects. 70% of the monies which you receive from the allottees would have to be deposited in this bank account. The money can be withdrawn from this bank account only for the purposes of cost of construction and the cost of land. The money can be withdrawn based on the percentage completion of the project. you would need 3 certificates for withdrawal, one from architect, one from engineer, and one from a chartered accountant. They would certify what is the percentage completion of the project, and basis that you can withdraw. There is an ambiguity around what constitutes cost of construction. There is some guidance which has been given by state rules in certain states. And I think at this point in time, things like borrowing for cost of construction, which includes your principal and interest, all that would be allowed to be taken out of this account. But if there is a borrowing on land, that as of now can't be taken out of this account. That has to be funded out of the 30% which goes to the developer straight away. Also, existing projects, certain state rules provide that 70% of the funds which are lying unutilized with the developer would need to be deposited in a separate bank account. So that's as far as existing accounts are concerned, existing projects are covered. There would be a quarterly disclosure which the developers would have to make. These disclosures would include things like what is the status of the project, how many units have been booked, what are the approvals which have been taken, what are the approvals which are pending, around timelines, and all these disclosures, this information would be made available to the general public. So in a sense, it would put a lot of pressure on the promoters or the developers to meet the commitments which they are making at the time of signing of the agreement. Whatsoever you are committed to the allottee at the time of sale has to be honored. If you want to make any change in the project or in the apartment, you will have to go back and seek the consent of the allottee. The unilateral changes are not permissible. Certain cases, like if you want to change something in common areas, you may seek the consent of 2/3 of the allottees and do that change. But for majority of the changes, you will have to go back to the apartment owners and seek their consent. There's kind of a defect liability or a warranty clause which has been introduced, and which means that within a period of 5 years, if there is any structural defect or any workmanship defect, the allottee would have a right to raise that with the developer, and the developer will have to rectify the defect within a period of 30 days. Now, the term used here is workmanship defect, which is a very wide connotation. Also, if there is any obligation which the developer has not met, the allottee has an option to raise that with the developer within a period of 5 years and get the developer to rectify it. I think this would clearly add to the cost of the project. In case a promoter wants to exit a project, it can't be a unilateral thing. For exiting a project and for a new promoter to step in, the consent of 2/3 of the allottees would be required. The obligations of the erstwhile promoter would need to be fulfilled by the new promoter. Now, this clause, I think, has clearly huge implications from the lender standpoint. If the lenders want to take over a project where a default has happened, it cannot be a unilateral thing. It will have to go through the allottee route, and they would need to seek consent of the allottees before they take over the project. And the lenders would then become the promoter of the project, and all obligations would fall upon them. So clearly, I think, food for thought for everybody as far as this rule is concerned. As I mentioned, all real estate agents would need to be covered, would need to register with the authority. And there are things specified. They can't indulge in mis-selling. They can't sell a project which is not registered. So there are do's and don'ts there for the real estate agents as well, and they will have to follow that. Otherwise, the consequences, again, are very severe. I think one of the most important provisions of RERA is around unfair trade practices. And this would include things like misrepresentations, things like, not meeting your commitments, things like showing a model apartment which you don't intend to deliver. So all that would constitute as unfair trade practice. And in that kind of scenario, the authority can cancel the registration of the promoter. And once the registration is cancelled, the promoter will be declared as a person in default, and his or her name would be shared across the country with all the authorities and will be displayed on the website. So it will do a huge reputational damage to the promoter if it comes down to a situation where he indulges in unfair trade practices. Similarly, the allottees would have a right to walk out of the project and seek refund and along with interest, or they can seek compensation. So I think as you go about, trying and understanding this act and developing processes, keep this procedure or keep this requirement in mind, because this is fairly stringent. Let me just now spend a couple of minutes on what we think the developers need to do, what are the imperatives for ensuring compliance with RERA. I think the first and the foremost is that it is not a compliance requirement. It is about change in mindset. I think industry has been used to working in a particular fashion, in a particular way. That clearly has to change. I think otherwise, I don't see industry complying with RERA. You may have to relook at your business model. The funding sources would need to be tied up well in advance, given the 70-30 rule. Certain developers are already talking about build and sell model. So I think we would probably see a lot of changes as far as the business model is concerned. Given the commitments which you are making on the timelines, on the quality, the defect liability provisions. It's very important that you beef up your processes around planning, around quality control, around project management. I think this will be a very important area, else you will end up on the wrong side of the law and be in trouble. Marketing practices, I think another area which will have to streamline. Whatever commitment you're making has to be fulfilled, otherwise it can be constituted as unfair trade practice. Your marketing teams would have to be made aware of these changes. Your marketing collaterals, everything would be on the RERA website, will be available to general public. And if you don't deliver the project, what you have promised, you can be in trouble. So I think marketing is one area which would require a lot of focus. Choosing the right partner, again, I think in terms of your contractors, your consultants, your suppliers, some of these obligations which you are taking would need to be passed on to them. So you need to make sure that you have right partners and watertight contracts with them in case of default. And lastly, I think, it is imperative that there are effective control mechanisms. If there is a deviation from law, that gets picked up and gets rectified before it becomes an issue. So things like project reviews would probably become common in this industry. So I think these are some of the imperatives which we believe developers would have to do in order to comply with the Act. And that probably would bring in the required change. So with that, let me bring it to a close, and I'm sure we'll have a very fruitful and engaging day today, and we'll debate some of these issues. Thank you very much.